Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. They say you don't just marry a person, you marry their family. For Mary, this saying felt more like a warning than a light-hearted joke. When she married Alexander, the love of her life, she thought she was gaining a supportive family. Instead, she found herself under the watchful and judgmental eye of Mrs. Rose, Alexander's mother. From the moment Mary stepped foot into the Smith household, Mrs. Rose made it clear Mary would have to earn her place. "Alexander deserves the best," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And the best is hard to find." Those words rang in Mary's ears, turning every family dinner and casual conversation into a silent battlefield. Mary wasn't a confrontational person. She tried to win Mrs. Rose over with small gestures, a favorite dish cooked with care, a spotless house after hours of cleaning, even indulging her mother-in-law's long stories about the good old days. But no matter what Mary did, it was never enough. Her cooking was too salty. The house wasn't clean enough. And once, Mrs. Rose even criticized the way Mary laughed. A lady should laugh with dignity, not like a hyena. Still, Mary told herself that patience and kindness would eventually break down Mrs. Rose's walls. But as time went on, it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of patience. It was a test. A test that Mrs. Rose seemed determined for Mary to fail. Then came the day Mary discovered the letter. It was an ordinary evening. Mary was tidying up the kitchen when she spotted a folded piece of paper tucked under a jar of sugar. Her name was scrawled on the front in Mrs. Rose's unmistakable handwriting. Curiosity got the better of her, and she unfolded the paper. What she found wasn't a warm note or a recipe, but a brutal list of her flaws. Each bullet point felt like a jab. She doesn't dress well enough. She's not polite when serving dinner. She's too soft to handle family life. Mary stared at the list, her hands trembling. Her initial reaction was heartbreak, but something else began to rise within her, resolve. She decided then and there that she would no longer be a silent target of Mrs. Rose's judgment. What happened next would change the dynamic of their family forever. Mary was no stranger to hard work. She had built her life around the belief that effort and kindness could overcome even the toughest challenges. But in Mrs. Rose's home, it felt like she was climbing a mountain that had no summit. From the very beginning, Mary poured her heart into trying to make a good impression. She learned Mrs. Rose's favorite recipes, hoping that a perfectly cooked roast or a beautifully layered cake would win her approval. But no matter how much effort Mary put in, Mrs. Rose always found something to criticize. "That's too salty," Mrs. Rose said with a wrinkle of her nose, pushing the plate away. "Next time, just stick to the recipe." Mary bit her lip, holding back the tears. She had followed the recipe to the letter, but to Mrs. Rose, perfection was always just out of reach. When Mary cleaned the house, Mrs. Rose would run her finger along the shelves, searching for dust like a detective hunting for evidence. "It's good, but you missed a spot," she'd say, pointing to some invisible speck only she could see. Even Mary's attempts to bond with her were met with resistance. Mrs. Rose would cut her off mid-conversation or compare her unfavorably to Alexander's ex-girlfriends. "You know, Alexander used to date someone who was really great at organizing events. She planned a charity gala once." Mary would nod politely, swallowing the sting of the backhanded compliment. But perhaps the hardest moments were the ones that felt personal, like when Mrs. Rose made comments about Mary's background. "People from small towns are sweet," she'd say with a tight smile, "but they don't always understand the demands of a family like ours." For months, Mary endured the constant criticisms and veiled insults. She told herself that Mrs. Rose just needed time to adjust, that things would get better. But deep down, she began to feel like she was losing herself. Every day felt like a test she was destined to fail. Yet, through it all, Mary refused to give up. Her love for Alexander and her determination to make their marriage work gave her strength. But even love has its limits, and Mary was beginning to reach hers. And then, just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, she found the letter. The letter wasn't something Mary went searching for. It practically found her. It was late in the evening, and she had just finished cleaning up after dinner. As she wiped down the counter, a folded piece of paper caught her eye, half hidden under the sugar jar. Her name, written in bold, neat handwriting, stopped her in her tracks. It was unmistakably Mrs. Rose's handwriting. For a moment, Mary hesitated. Should she open it? Was this a note meant for her, or had it been left there by accident? Curiosity outweighed caution, and with trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. What she saw wasn't a note or a friendly message. It was a list. A list of her flaws. Mary's weaknesses was written at the top, as if Mrs. Rose had been compiling it for weeks. The bullet points were brutal. She's not confident enough to host family events. She can't even iron shirts properly. Her cooking is mediocre at best. She lacks sophistication and grace. Mary's heart sank with every word. The criticisms were relentless, attacking everything from her housekeeping skills to her very character. It was as though Mrs. Rose had taken every insecurity Mary had and written it down in black and white. At first, Mary felt crushed. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, she thought about crumpling the letter and throwing it away. But as she stood there, staring at the damning words, something shifted inside her. A fire began to burn where the hurt had been. Why had she allowed Mrs. Rose to treat her this way? Why had she let the opinions of one person dictate her sense of self-worth? Mary realized that this list, as hurtful as it was, said more about Mrs. Rose than it did about her. With a newfound sense of resolve, Mary folded the letter and placed it on the table. She wasn't going to hide it or pretend it didn't exist. Instead, she made a decision. This wasn't just about defending herself anymore. This was about standing up for her marriage, her love for Alexander, and her right to be respected. Little did Mrs. Rose know, her list had sparked something she couldn't have anticipated, a confrontation that would change everything. The dinner table was set, just like every other evening, but tonight the air felt different. Mary sat in her usual spot, her heart pounding as she glanced at the folded letter sitting neatly in her lap. Alexander sat beside her, oblivious to the storm brewing. Across from her sat Mrs. Rose, calmly sipping her tea, her sharp eyes scanning the room as though she owned it. Mary had made her decision. She was no longer going to let Mrs. Rose's words control her. It was time to speak up. As dinner began, the usual conversation floated around the table. Alexander's work updates, Mrs. Rose's subtle critiques of the meal, and Mary's polite, quiet responses. But halfway through the meal, Mary took a deep breath and gently placed her fork down. "Mrs. Rose," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I think we need to talk about something." Mrs. Rose raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Oh? And what might that be?" she asked, dabbing her mouth with her napkin. Mary didn't hesitate. She placed the letter on the table, sliding it toward Mrs. Rose. "I found this in the kitchen earlier today," she said calmly. The room fell silent. Alexander looked from the letter to Mary, then to his mother, confusion etched across his face. Mrs. Rose, however, didn't flinch. She adjusted herself in her chair, glancing at the folded paper as if it were nothing of importance. "And what exactly is this?" Mrs. Rose asked, her voice cool and composed. "It's a list," Mary replied, locking eyes with her mother-in-law. "A list of my flaws. Written in your handwriting." The tension at the table was suffocating. Alexander's face turned pale as he reached for the letter, quickly scanning its contents. His jaw tightened as he looked at his mother. "Mom, is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Mrs. Rose sat back in her chair, folding her arms. "It's not a joke. It's my observations," she said matter-of-factly. "Every word on that list is true. I was simply being honest." Mary took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't back down. "Honest," she repeated. "Honesty isn't tearing someone down without giving them a chance to prove themselves. I've done nothing but try to be kind, respectful, and a good wife to Alexander. But instead of giving me a chance, you've been waiting for me to fail." Mrs. Rose stared at her, her expression unreadable. Mary continued, her voice growing stronger. "You don't have to like me, Mrs. Rose. But I love your son, and I'm not going anywhere. This family is important to me, and I will fight for it, even if that means standing up to you." Alexander, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Mom, Mary's right. This has gone too far. She's my wife, and she shouldn't have to fight for your approval. She's part of this family whether you like it or not." For the first time, Mrs. Rose looked shaken. She glanced at Alexander, then at Mary, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to struggle with what to say, her confidence suddenly wavering. I didn't mean to make you feel like you don't belong," she said at last, her voice quieter than usual. "I've only ever wanted what's best for Alexander." "And what's best for Alexander," Mary replied gently, "is a family that supports him and the people he loves." The silence that followed was heavy but not hostile. Mrs. Rose lowered her gaze to the plate in front of her. For the first time, she seemed to be reflecting, her sharp exterior softening just a little. Dinner continued that night, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't a miraculous transformation. Mrs. Rose didn't suddenly shower Mary with praise, but the wall she had built around herself showed their first cracks. The days following the confrontation were quiet, almost too quiet. Mary didn't know what to expect. Would Mrs. Rose double down on her criticism, or would she finally soften? The answer didn't come right away, but small signs began to appear, like faint rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It started with the little things. Mrs. Rose no longer commented on Mary's cooking with her usual sharpness. Instead of calling it too salty or too bland, she began saying things like, "Not bad," or "It's growing on me." They weren't glowing compliments, but to Mary, they felt like victories. One morning, Mary walked into the living room to find Mrs. Rose folding laundry. She looked up briefly and said, "You missed a button on this shirt," before handing it to Mary. There was no venom in her tone, just a simple observation. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Over time, Mrs. Rose began to engage Mary in small conversations, not the shallow, polite ones they'd had before, but real discussions. She asked about Mary's job, her family, even her hobbies. It was as if, for the first time, she was trying to see Mary as a person, not just an intruder in her son's life. The real turning point came a few weeks later during a family gathering. Mrs. Rose had invited some relatives over for dinner, and Mary had volunteered to help cook. As the guests sat around the table, Mrs. Rose raised her glass for a toast. "I just want to say," she began, her voice steady but with a hint of emotion, "that it's not always easy welcoming someone new into the family. But Mary has shown me something I didn't expect: strength, patience, and a love for Alexander that's undeniable. I may not have been fair to her at first, but I can see now that she's exactly what this family needed." Mary's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Alexander, who smiled and squeezed her hand under the table. It wasn't just the words that touched her, it was the sincerity in Mrs. Rose's voice. For the first time, Mary felt truly seen and accepted. From that moment on, their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. Mrs. Rose still had her sharp edges, but they were tempered by a newfound respect for Mary. And Mary, in turn, began to see the vulnerable woman behind the tough exterior, a woman who, like anyone else, just wanted to protect her family. Looking back, Mary realized that the struggle with Mrs. Rose had taught her something invaluable. It wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about understanding that relationships, even the hardest ones, can evolve. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with patience, love, and a little confrontation when needed, even the deepest rifts can begin to heal. As Mary sat beside Alexander one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace. Her marriage had been tested, her self-worth challenged, but in the end, she had come out stronger. Because in the Smith household, it wasn't just the shadows of Mrs. Rose's judgment that loomed, it was also the warmth of her eventual acceptance. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.